All right, so let's shift to the environment. If you listen to the news, it's getting hotter, everybody's freaking out about everything, we don't have clean water, all of these things. Calm me down.
Well, I don't want to get into a debate over the science of global warming. I'll leave it to the specialists. Certainly, I do acknowledge that there is a consensus that the world is warming. Whether it is warming at a too high rate or a lukewarming rate, and where it's heading, obviously, prediction of the future that's the most difficult thing. I'm going to leave that to specialists and to scientists.
Yeah. Just very quickly on that, though, is it possible that in some of the places that it's warming, it's actually good that it's warming?
Well, certainly this one scientist from Holland called Professor Toll has calculated the likely costs and benefits of global warming until 2080 or so, and he thought that because of the growing because of the longer growing season, we'll be able to actually bring in more food, grow more food. Mm-hmm. He also thought that there's also some evidence that the world is greening as a result of more CO2 in the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. But I do acknowledge, I want to make it very clear, I don't want any hate mail to you or to me.
You're going to get hate mail either way, but acknowledge away.
I want to acknowledge that there are serious concerns, and I'm basically a guy who's a techno-optimist. I want to look for solutions to these problems, rather than what I don't want to do is to stop economic development. I don't want to stop economic development in developing countries, because it's extremely important that people who are very, very poor should not be very, very poor. Mm-hmm. It's very important that if a woman in Angola or in Zambia has a premature birth, she should be able to have an access to an incubator that is run on an electricity grid that is not going to collapse. Mm-hmm. For example, okay, that people can air condition their homes, let's say in Africa, or they can keep themselves warm in Argentina. Basically, that is my goal, not to stop economic development. Mm-hmm. That is particularly true of poor countries, but I also think that it applies to rich countries. If we can make life more comfortable for people, I see no. I think it would be very difficult, especially within the democratic context, to stop that. Now look at what's happening in Macron's Paris. Mm-hmm. We've seen riots that country hasn't seen since the 1960s. Why is that? That's because the environmental concerns of the French elite, Macron included, are bumping against the living standards and limitations on the living standards of ordinary French men and women. If you increase the price of electricity dramatically in order to make people cut down on electricity, it's also going to reduce both their comfort but also their standard of living. Mm-hmm. If you're going to put additional taxes on this, that, and the other, cars, gasoline, what have you, eventually people are going to get upset and are going to start voting for some very unpleasant people. Mm-hmm. And this is something that we see happening throughout Europe. Now, there are many different reasons why people vote for unpleasant political parties, but a fundamental feeling that standards of living in Europe are stagnating and that they are being taxed to a point where they actually have to go out and protest in the streets, burn hundreds of cars, mm-hmm. and basically vandalize the Arc de Triomphe. Okay, yeah. So these things are happening. So what I want to do is to sort of navigate a middle course between concerns over the environment and continued economic development and continued prosperity. And I think that the answer could potentially be found in techno-optimism, as I would call it. So I would consider fracking to be a good example of techno-optimism, okay? Burning of 1 unit of natural gas produces half as much CO2 emissions as burning of coal. Mm-hmm. So I think it would make a lot of sense to burn more natural gas than coal. But Our friends on the environmental side hate that because it's still fossil fuels. Okay, so let's forget about fossil fuels. Let's have nuclear energy. Okay, last time anybody has died from a nuclear accident was in Chernobyl because the communist leadership cut corners when it came to safety, and there was a breakdown of chain of command and whatever, and there was this accident where dozens of people died. But since then, not a single person has died as a result of nuclear accidents, including in Fukushima, which is the most recent one. So nuclear energy is a perfect example of producing a lot of energy without any CO2 emissions. Are our friends in the environmentalist movement pleased? No, they are not. Let's take another example. Say fertilizer. Let's say that we can genetically engineer crops to need less fertilizer and less pesticides. Why do we want less fertilizer and less pesticides? Because when those flow into rivers and then into oceans, they can have a negative consequence for wildlife. So ideally, we would like to use less fertilizer, less pesticide. So imagine that through GMOs, through genetic engineering, we could produce crops that don't require pesticides and fertilizer. Are our friends in the environmental lobby happy? No, they hate that.
They hate those three letters.
So every single
GMO.
time that we offer, as techno-optimists, we offer a gradual move in the right direction, which cumulatively could have a massive impact on quality of life, on environmental protection, and so forth. The answer is always no.
So it's interesting because when you started talking about this, there's this immediate hesitancy because I think everyone, if you talk about climate at all, people think you're going to get slammed. And I can tell you the most hate that I ever got on the show was when I had Alex Epstein on, who wrote a book called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And he wasn't denying climate science, he was just saying that fossil fuels, in his estimation, are still the best way to advance human prosperity going forward. So it's interesting, you immediately said you didn't want to go too far down that road because it just opens up the hate and all that. But in essence what you're saying is that we're having to fight the environmentalists on what you would prescribe as the best ways to move the environment forward. That's pretty fascinating. So how do you get through to these people then?
Well, I don't know. I'm trying. One of the things I'm trying to explain to a lot of my friends is that actually prosperity and economic development can be a friend of the environment. That's because of this concept of environmental Kuznets curve. Now, that's just a fancy way of saying that when people grow richer, they are willing to spend more money on clean environment and protection of animals. How do I know that? Because well, it's not just stats which show it, but also look at the real life examples. When the economy collapsed in Zimbabwe, the first thing the people did in order to survive was to start slaughtering animals in the wild. Shooting zebras for meat, shooting elephants for tusks, and the environment took a huge knock. In Venezuela, when the economy collapsed, both socialist countries, by the way, but never mind. In Venezuela, when the economy collapsed, people started slaughtering animals in the zoo. The only way you can survive, if it's a choice between the life of an antelope and the survival of a child, you know exactly what to do. And so economic development, making people richer, is actually a very good way of accomplishing this environmental Kuznets curve. When people grow rich, they start caring about the air they breathe, they start caring about welfare of animals and so on and so forth, because those are, from the perspective of the survival of the human being, luxury goods. And we are already seeing some very interesting things happening around the world. For example, the forest coverage of the Earth is still declining by about 0.08% per year. But it is declining primarily, if not exclusively, in poor countries, and especially in Africa and also Latin America. But it is increasing in rich countries, afforestation is taking place. There are more forests being grown. And in China, we are seeing a huge amount of afforestation because the country is now richer than what it used to be. So through economic development, we can do that. Through economic development, we can also start protecting more of our marine life by creating exclusion zones against fishing and so forth. How can we do that? Why is that connected to economic development? Well, because if you, for example, you can, not only do you have more technological ways of monitoring who is breaking the rules, but also you can still get access to the food you want through aquaculture. Okay, so countries which are richer are able to get their food from aquaculture rather than from ordinary shore fishing.
So when it comes to these solutions, which, by the way, I mean, what you just said there, it's pretty mind-blowing that in much of the world, it's getting greener. You know, I mean, people just don't think about that. We just sort of just don't accept that that's real. Most of this, do you see that we have to have a sort of public and private partnership on how we move forward on these things? Should most of this come from governments? Should it come from private corporations? Should it come from individual people? I mean, that seems to be what a lot of the debate is also about.
Well, I think that the evidence for the efficacy of government spending when it comes to science, when it comes to scientific research, for example, is not all that persuasive. I don't think that governments are particularly good at spending money on scientific research.
Meaning that the research is shoddy, or just that they throw money at things and then just nothing comes of it?
Yeah, that would be part of the reason. I am a believer in private companies doing their own research, driven by the profit motive. For example, energy inputs into production of anything, from a can of Coke to a bottle of water, cost money. Companies actually do have an incentive, a profit incentive, to try to limit the amount of resources they use in order to produce any type of good. In the 1970s, between 1970s and today, the number of cans of Coke that you could get from a pound of aluminum has actually increased by something like 40%. That's because companies don't want to spend money they don't have to spend on electricity, on spending money on natural resources and raw materials and what have you. And so what we are actually seeing is that the number of dollars per the amount of energy we need in order to produce a dollar of output is actually declining, and that's happening naturally through the process of profit maximization on the parts of corporations. Now, that doesn't mean that there is absolutely no need for any kind of regulations. We don't want corporations to be dumping toxic materials in our pristine rivers and what have you. But what I am saying is that corporations in search for profit are actually very good at coming up with innovative solutions to environmental problems.
Yeah. Is part of the problem here also that different countries that are at different stages of their evolution, of their economies and everything else, need different things, need wildly different things? What's happening in China now with growth is very different than what's happening in the United States or India or any of these countries that now have to, that are often putting out more CO2 and emissions and things like that. They're going through their industrial revolutions. We already did it. So that we have an unequal playing field when it comes to some of this.
Yes, so that is a well-known notion within economic development, that as a country starts on a path to industrialization, its damage to the environment increases, but once again it reaches that inflection point, and then it starts to decrease as people become rich enough to start to appreciate nice environment. 90% of the plastics that are entering our oceans come from 8 rivers. They are all in the developing world, in Africa and in Asia. The contribution of Western advanced economies to plastic pollution of the oceans is negligible, precisely because we are able to spend more money and effort and thought on how not to do it.
What would you say to the people that would say our time is up here, or the evolution of humanity is that we've got to go to the stars, that eventually we'll have to get off this mortal coil and do it again somewhere else?
Well, first of all, it is very important to remember that pessimism about humanity's future has been with us since the dawn of writing. From antiquity and ancient poems and epics, you know, after all, the flood. What is it about the flood? It's about cleansing the world from
depressing
a population that went array. Cato the Elder, writing in 2nd century BC, thought that Rome was finished because you know, the young were corrupted, and women had loose morals, and men were too effeminate to fight wars. And this is when Rome was just a small town in you know, with a few provinces in Italy. Rome continued to expand for the next 300 to 400 years.
But so he was just very early.
He was just very early, but you can see every generation thinks that we are, especially as we grow older, we think that the world is entering a period of decline, whereas in fact what we are doing, we are projecting our own physical decline onto the world. But so far, those warnings about the imminent collapse of humanity have always been proven wrong, as Thomas Babington Macaulay, the 19th century British politician and writer, has written on what basis is it that, having seen all this progress that we have made behind us, we see nothing but misery in front of us. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the essence of what he said, and I think he's absolutely right.
Yeah, so we've done the diseases we're eradicating, we're doing a lot of good on the environment, or at least have some options now.
We do have options, yes.
Yeah. What else should we be hitting on to give people some positivity to think about? Well,
I think my pet peeve is that I think that people don't read enough history, aren't enough versed in history, how life really used to be like before. And I wish that people would spend more time thinking about what they are doing on their daily basis and asking themselves, would I be able to do this in the past? I just had a crown put in, or a root canal operation with anesthetic, and it was not something, and it wasn't particularly pleasant.
Right.
But
it was better than it would have been 100 years ago. 100
or 200 years ago, you would have it, you know, somebody would have to pull it out of your mouth. So that's one thing. I think that people, and I think that if people understand history better and how life truly was quite horrific until very recent times. Again, we are 300,000 years old, but the time of abundance is roughly 200 years old, 250 years old. Maybe they will be more grateful, and for the things that we have, and hopefully they will be more appreciative and more supporting of the institutions which underpin modernity. Liberal democracy, with all of its warts, with all of its imperfections, it is still functioning better than Putin's Russia or Erdogan's Turkey. Free market capitalism, does it have its problems? Yes. We shouldn't socialize costs of banking, for example, and privatize gains from Wall Street banking. But again, it is the best creator of wealth known to humankind. And so throwing it out because there are imperfections on the margins that we should be working on to improve would be a great mistake. So yes, appreciation of the past, gratitude for the present, hopefulness for the future, those are the steps, I think, in the right direction.
That, my friend, is an A+ ending to an interview. And for more on Marian and the incredible work that Think Progress is doing, you guys can check out thinkprogress.org.